Thanks for being here, and good morning, everybody. My name is Alex Bertolucci. I am the Oregon Communications Manager for Circular Action Alliance, and today is the first webinar in a series of webinars about different sections of the Oregon Program Plan. During today's webinar, we're going to review the Oregon funding agreements. And as you'll notice, this is part one. The second part will take place on March 26th. We have several other webinars taking place in this series, and you can find more information and register for those at the link that my colleague Jerry is going to drop into the chat here in just a moment. I also want to let folks know that this webinar is focused on funding agreements for local governments and service providers. So while we appreciate all of the interest in today's webinar, producers might not get a lot out of the session. CA does have many producer-focused webinars that can be found in the producer resource section of the CA website, and Jerry can drop a link to that page in the chat as well. So if you've registered for this webinar and you're here and you're realizing that maybe it's not the right fit for you today, feel free to drop off. No hard feelings on our end. We just want to make sure that the right information is getting to the right folks. Today's meeting will have time for question and answer at the end of the webinar. So we ask that you please use the Q&A tool that you can find in your Zoom toolbar to ask questions. That helps us manage those a little bit easier and keep track of those. I will now turn it over to Kim Holmes, Executive Director for CAA Oregon, to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Alex and Jerry, for all the support on the webinar today and the webinar series going forward. We hope that this brings a lot of value to the community in Oregon that we'll be working with. So with the launch of our funding agreement initiative, I think we can all agree this is kind of the official kickoff of implementation, which is really exciting. This is a journey that we look forward to traveling with our partners, bringing producers in partnership with local governments, service providers, and DEQ to really bring the RMA alive and launch July 1. So the funding agreements are really going to be a foundational piece of CAA being to meet our obligation for a number of our funding responsibilities in the state. And so what we hope to do today is to introduce the funding agreement structure to each of you, review the addendums that will cover each of the funding streams, walk through some timelines, and overall just give you some thoughts and ideas to carry forward in your conversations with local governments and service providers. So with that, we'll dive into a little overview of who Circular Action Alliance is, if you are not familiar with us as an organization. Circular Action Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit producer responsibility organization. It was founded by 20 companies covering largely the food, beverage, and consumer goods and retail sectors in anticipation of the meeting their packaging EPR obligations that were emerging in states around the country. CAA has been approved to be the single pro in California, Colorado, and is on the Maryland Advisory Council. And CAA is the only pro that has submitted program plans thus far in the state. We submitted our final program plan on December 6th and is currently in the final review process. And we anticipate hearing final feedback from DEQ in the few very short weeks ahead of us, no later than mid-February. Next slide, please. CAA's overall mission, as I stated, it was founded by the brands, the founding member brands, to really help producers comply with those EPR laws and drive harmonization where possible across the states and really deliver the best-in-class services for compliance, making it a good experience for the regulators we're working with, the producers we represent, and the recycling system and infrastructure we're working with. With the formation of individual state teams, like the one I lead here in Oregon, it allows us to meet the state-specific regulatory requirements. Each law is unique, and we're prepared to respond to that. And it also allows us to leverage existing recycling systems within the state and infrastructure to make sure that we are additive and truly advancing the system that's currently in place. So, and the goal, obviously, the overarching goal is to advance the circularity of materials through collaboration with the local governments and service providers. And so with that, I'll give you a little review of the team. We continue to grow, and we've assembled really quite a talented group of individuals that will help each of you walk through the implementation phase and the service delivery phase of the Recycling Modernization Act. We have team members that will oversee segments such as management of USCL materials. We have a team developing to manage the accepted materials on the PRO list that will be collected through the depot system. And we have reporting and compliance manager to make sure that we are tracking all of our progress and reporting that accordingly to DEQ. And we have a fabulous project manager who keeps us all on task. Our team will continue to grow through the year, and we look forward to working with each of you as we move through the implementation phase. Next slide. So we'll start with an overview of the timeline of our funding agreement development and execution process. So we are currently in an open consultation phase for the primary funding agreement and the addenda. That opened on January 6th. And closes today, so there still is time to offer feedback. In the middle of that, we actually did start consultation with Priority A group communities, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. In terms of the funding agreements, the consultation does close today, and all of those comments are being received and reviewed by our legal team, Miller Nash. They will work to integrate to the best extent possible the comments that have been received and produce the final agreement templates in early February. At that point, CAA will make the availability of the final agreements known to the partners across Oregon so that you can access those, download those, and begin reviewing those. DEQ in the Opportunity to Recycle Act reporting process has created a deadline to designate funding recipients, who will receive the different funding streams by March 31st. We'll talk about the timeline of that. You can go ahead and get agreements in place and do those designations with us early, but just recognizing it will be cross-referenced with what was officially submitted in those reports. We're really aiming to get primary funding agreements completed by early May. And then for those different funding streams that should begin to flow in July 1, we're really hoping to get those addenda in place no later than early June. So we can ensure a smooth transition for all of the payments and financial support that is coming to the partners across the state. Next slide. So at a very high level, this is the funding agreement structure. We have a primary funding agreement, and we'll talk about that, but everyone will be expected to sign the primary funding agreement. Behind that will be an amendment that will list out the funding elements and designations of the different funding streams. And then depending on which funding streams you as an organization will be receiving, you would then have an addendum that matches that funding stream. And so on the next slide, we talk about kind of the benefits of having this modular approach in our funding system. So by breaking these pieces out, it affords those parties that are signing the agreements really the opportunity to consult with their different constituent groups that are necessary and involved in each of these individual funding streams. So for example, the conversations that may be having around the transportation reimbursement funding stream might be very different than the parties you're having conversations with around the contamination reduction funding stream. We wanted to make sure that we created a system where we could allow parties to kind of have those conversations and move at their own pace for each of those, and then allow those pieces to come together. This also allows us the ability to make updates for funding without having to open up the entire agreement. For example, we anticipate that the glass incentive, the glass collection incentive, will be adjusted on an annual rate to match the cost of managing glass to the depot. We'll be able to go in and simply update that rate in the addendum rather than having to update the whole funding agreement. It also allows for fairly easy changes to the designations for the funding stream. If, for example, a hauler changes for the transportation of your materials, you can simply go into that amendment and change that designation there. So we feel that this approach really gives us the flexibility for not only getting these agreements into place, but managing them long term with the greatest ease for both parties. And we can dive into the specific elements of each of these pieces. So as I mentioned, the primary funding agreement. This document will capture the general terms and conditions of the funding relationship. And so a local government or service provider seeking funding, identified in any of the implementation elements of the program plan, will need this in place. And we note that no purchases or orders should be made first without having an executed funding agreement in place with or with CAA. The expenditures and activities that a local government or service provider chooses to undertake outside of what's been defined in the program plan or outside of the obligations of CAA according to statute will not be eligible for reimbursement. So we ask that people very clearly understand what's being outlined in those agreements and be mindful of that as they plan their activities going forward. And CAA intends to process the funding requests in the order that the funding agreements are completed and signed. So that is why we are looking a bit forward before the implementation date of July 1 to try to get as many of those agreements in place so payment terms can be put into the service provider portal and our accounting system so that we can ensure a smooth transition on payments come July 1 and not have to work through too much of a backlog after that. We want to get as much taken care of preceding that date as possible. Okay, so the funding designation amendment, as I mentioned, it will capture which entities receive funding streams as directed by the local government. That is the designation process that is currently happening through the opportunity to recycle reporting. Right now, local governments, if they choose to not receive the money directly because they are not delivering that service necessarily, this is their opportunity to designate the recipient of that money. Conversely, if you are a entity being designated to receive funding from a jurisdiction, that will also be captured in that funding designation amendment. That just allows us an opportunity to very clearly make sure both parties understand who's relinquishing their right to certain funds and who, as their designee, are receiving those funds. So considerations for the funding designation amendment. As I mentioned, DEQ's official designation process is currently underway and closes on March 31st. You should be having conversations right now with your service providers and other potential recipients of your funding. So have those conversations, get those captured in there. But we can go ahead and also be kind of logging those designations through the amendments. If you end up and through the funding agreement amendment and addendum, if you are moving through the funding agreement process quicker than your OTR reporting process. So as I said, those can move in parallel. And then we will go ahead and cross-check those against each other to make sure that they match. Next slide, please. Okay, so the addenda. So for each stream of funding, jurisdiction, service provider, or pro-collection partner is eligible to receive an addenda that describes the specific terms and conditions of that funding stream will need to be signed and included as part of the funding agreement package. The addenda will include the details of what information must be submitted to CAA, the time frame within which payments will occur, and any additional information that needs to be submitted to verify performance. So we can talk about some examples of that as we move into an overview of the individual addendum. Okay, so kicking things off with contamination reduction funding. So this is a funding stream that local governments are eligible to receive to undertake contamination reduction education activities. So this activity can be taken directly by the local government or on behalf of local governments to comply with the contamination reduction activities outlined in the Opportunity to Recycle Act and the Recycling Modernization Act. So this is a funding stream to support some of the required activities that local governments need to undertake. So who needs to sign this? Whichever entity is going to receive the up to $3 per capita funding for administering the qualifying contamination reduction activities as defined by DEQ. As I said, this could be local governments. In some cases, it's the service provider that conducts this on behalf of the local governments. In some cases, this could be activity that's undertaken at the county level, that all of the local governments work together and support the county taking on that activity. So the designation could look very different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so who needs to have signed this? So whenever when does this need to be signed by? This is one that local governments need to have some internal discussions around the timing of this amendment or addendum. So, for example, if local governments will be applying for this funding right at the beginning of the launch of the program, July 1, in anticipation of the program education programming that will be delivered through the year, then go ahead and prepare to sign it early and get that request submitted. Some local governments we've heard are going to take the strategy that they have already budgeted for that activity. And so they will undertake that activity and then ask for that funding at the end of the year once they've confirmed that all of that activity has taken place. And so that's perfectly acceptable too. So this is one where we can really work with the timing and needs of the local governments. And if you have any questions about that, our team is happy to field those for you. And then, so what do you need to know to be ready to approach this particular addendum? So again, determining which activity will undertake these activities, and making sure that that is also clearly designated in your Opportunity to Recycle Act reporting due March 31st. Next slide, please. So the glass incentive addendum. So as I mentioned, using this one as an example that might get updated on an annual basis with the incentive rate. This really covers the incentive payment, which this year will be $77 a ton. That's associated with the reporting requirements and the continued collection activities for communities that would like to maintain their curbside glass collection or an existing glass depot collection system. As I mentioned, that rate will be updated annually to match the cost of managing that same material through the Pro Depot collection system. Who needs to sign this one? Local governments that want to receive the $77 a ton payment, or if they choose to have that money go directly to the service provider providing that service, they can also designate that service provider as the recipient. This is one that we really would like to have completed well in advance of the July 1 start date, because this is payment to the parties that have these activities currently underway. This is not something that we're anticipating a launch of. This is existing activity that CAA is going to begin to pay an incentive to continue that activity. So we are targeting the date of June 1 for all of these addendums to be in place where existing glass collection activity is occurring. And so you'll really want to evaluate what glass collection activity is currently happening in my jurisdiction and who's responsible for it. And do we want to continue it? There is always the option too to shift to the pro glass collection model if for some reason the current system is not working for that jurisdiction or service provider. So in that case, reach out to our team, warrants a discussion, and we can figure out the best path forward and get that addendum in place for you so you begin to receive that funding at the offset of the program if you choose to maintain that service. The next addendum that we'll cover is the payments to support the local government USCL depot collection activities. And so this addendum covers the costs associated with establishing, enhancing, and or managing a USCL depot collection point as compliance to the opportunity to recycle or the new RMA requirements. Again, who needs to sign this? This is kind of a recurring theme. It's either the local government or the service providers that are operating the depot in that jurisdiction. So again, it might look a bit unique for each community and service provider. Um, when does this one need to be signed? This is another one that we would like to have in place by June 1 for existing operations, or when new USCL collection points become funded in the order of their priority group. So if you're a jurisdiction that already has a location, let's get that addendum in place, and so you can begin to receive your financial support at the offset of the program. There are some depots that are scheduled for our system expansion funding in accordance to priority, and so in advance, the payment for those depots will coincide with when those depots open, and all of that will be laid out in the system expansion consultation period that will occur with our team, and which is already underway for the priority A communities. And so, what should you be doing now to get ready? Evaluate what USCL collection may be immediately eligible for funding. And for new collection locations, begin to determine all the site improvements, equipment that's needed, so that you're prepared to bring that to the table when we have that system expansion consultation discussion, making sure that we're capturing all of the needs of that the depot. Since we weren't able to capture the ORSOP's survey was pretty comprehensive, but there are still details that we'll need to bring to the table to ultimately determine truly the improvements and expansions and equipment upgrades that will be necessary. And also begin to estimate the volumes of material that you anticipate receiving. Obviously, more populated jurisdictions may have their sites utilized more frequently, where more rural jurisdictions may not, right? So begin to try to estimate your per capita collection, which will also help us anticipate what that equipment need will be and the staffing requirements. And then lastly, we'll want to consider your signage needs as well to make sure that your area is clearly designated for the public to use. So a bit in parallel to that, this addendum, the Pro Depot Service Addendum, outlines the compensation that our partners will receive for hosting a collection point for pro materials. Who needs to sign this? Any entity that is hosting a collection point. So this one could be a bit more expansive, could be the local government, could be a service provider, could be a community-based organization. We are working with a wide network of potential partners on the Pro Depot. And so if we are in discussions with you, this is an addendum you're going to want to take a look at and be prepared to review and execute on when the timing is right. So as we've stated in the program plan and in the Recycling Council review process, it is our intent to roll out the Pro Depot network on a region by region basis. So the first region, Zone 1, we're going to begin to have those conversations with the depot collection points in that zone in the coming weeks. And then we'll go to Zone 2, Zone 3. So the conversations around those will, as we get further into the zones, so we could be having conversations with Zone 4 or 5 in 2026, even though they're not scheduled to open up till 2027. You'll have hopefully your contract in place well in advance, so we have plenty of time for all of the planning that's necessary to roll that out. So this one is kind of a take a look at it, but hold until we have conversations with our team about your zone and when that will occur. Okay, the roll cart addendum. So this is one that we feel we needed to have in place, but will likely not be needing to pay on until we see some of the pricing dynamics change in the marketplace for roll carts with minimum PCR. So statute does require that CAA pay that delta between pricing when it exists for carts that are 100% virgin plastic and carts that contain at least 10% post-consumer recycle plastics. So we're not paying for the whole cart for a replacement, but when that pricing delta exists, we pay for that delta. The reality is right now in the marketplace, there is no delta, and most cart manufacturers are already using 10% recycled content. This is something that we will continue to monitor on a quarterly basis, and will alert the community to if that pricing delta begins to emerge. So it'll be good to have this in place. So if and when that pricing delta does emerge, that can kick into effect. And when orders are necessary to be made, we can offer that compensation in a timely fashion. But this is one I would say if you need to prioritize some of the other addendum, because they would be kind of active funding beginning July 1, this is one that could be prioritized, but don't let it fall off your radar. And then system expansion funding. So as you all have probably seen in the program plan, we have our schedule of investments for system expansion funding. So this addendum will cover the funding that each jurisdiction or service provider will receive on behalf of the jurisdiction to enable them to transition to collecting the full range of USCL materials and be in compliance with both Opportunity to Recycle and the Recycling Modernization Act. This is one that will be the provisions of this, the funding provisions will be very specifically spelled out for each of these addendum. They are going to be unique for each community and each service provider. And our team will be working very closely with local governments and service providers as their priority group comes up to make sure that we have everything accurately captured, that enables the community to make that transition. As I mentioned, we are in discussions with priority A groups right now at the moment, and then we will move to priority B. We have made a commitment to DEQ and the Recycling Council that for those communities that participated in the needs assessment but did not necessarily participate in the ORSOP survey that enabled us to make that schedule of investment, we will revisit those communities in the order of their priority group to give them another chance to participate in the funding opportunity and work with our team to identify what their funding needs might be. So who needs to sign this? Local governments or their designated service provider. Again, these are conversations that local governments and their service providers need to be having, kind of who will be receiving the funding for managing kind of which pieces of the system enhancement, and when does it need to be signed by? So this is during the open consultation period for each of the priority groups. That's when communities or service providers will want to start looking at this addendum. Certainly download it, review it, have your legal team review it and get comfortable with it. But we won't start defining those specific funding elements until we have that consultation opportunity with each local government. And so what you can be doing right now is making sure that you've cataloged really everything that you need from an investment perspective. If you can't recall what you submitted on your ORSOP survey, you are welcome to reach out to our team. We've been very responsive to inquiries from local governments asking for their survey results. And so that can be used as a starting point for you to kind of better flesh that out in preparation of the consultation. So we encourage you to take that opportunity as well. All right, transportation reimbursement. So this is one that I think needs particular attention and discussion between local governments and their service providers. So really want to highlight that. So this is a funding opportunity for any entity that is moving the opportunity to recycle materials, transporting it more than 50 miles to the nearest CRPF or responsible end market with the capacity to receive it. And so local governments are strongly encouraged to designate the operator of their local transfer station or reload facility as the recipient of this funding. Now, this gets a little bit tricky because this might not necessarily be your hauler, as is the case in my community. My hauler takes it to a transfer station that is managed by another hauler. So there is no existing contractual relationship between my city and the reload facility. This can very easily be overcome with a simple designation, but it does require the local government to understand kind of who that party is to designate. and be comfortable with that. And so this addendum covers the calculated transportation reimbursement. We worked with Cascadia to develop a time-based model that reimburses for the transportation. We've socialized that with the hauling community and has overwhelming support as that approach. That's another model that will be updated based on fluctuations in fuel pricing, labor costs, et cetera. When does this need to be signed by? This is another one that we strongly encourage everyone to have settled and signed by June 1, because this is one of those funding obligations that transporters will be eligible to receive come July 1. So this is one that we strongly encourage local governments, transfer stations, and other transporters of material to prioritize early in February. And so what can you be doing now to get ready? If you are a transporter, say an operator of a reload facility, begin to determine all of the local governments that have material flowing into your facility so that you know kind of the universe of the local governments that you need to be having a conversation with. And if you are a local government, as I said, you need to be figuring out kind of who the appropriate party is to designate for this funding. And I'm sure if it's not your service provider can certainly help facilitate the answer to that in that conversation. Okay, the one that we are not reviewing today, because it's not part of the consultation process, is that last addendum, which is for the payment of the PCRF and the CMF. So that's the processor commodity risk fee and the contamination management fee that will go to the commingle recycle facilities. We will be in direct consultation with the CRPFs to review that draft, integrate their feedback, and then work specifically with them on that. So know that that work is underway, but not necessarily for this audience today. Okay, so at a high level, the funding agreement process, as I mentioned, we anticipate having those final versions of the funding agreement out in early February. We'll give you notice of that. So we encourage all local governments and service providers, go ahead and download that final agreement, in particular, the primary funding agreement, because everyone's going to need that in place, and begin to work with that. And then identify which addenda will be related to other funding elements that you'll receive. And so begin that work with your legal team and doing internal reviews. Fill out the jurisdiction specific information that's requested in the primary funding agreement, and perform any final review to address the unique operating conditions of the jurisdiction or the service provider. Because we have had this longer consultation period and we're receiving good broad feedback from both local governments and haulers, thank you very much if you've submitted some already, we anticipate that we will be coming up with a template that is largely acceptable to most parties, but we do recognize that there will be some unique situations that we'll need to account for. And our legal team is prepared to work with local governments and service providers when that situation arises. So kind of once we've gone through the process of getting all the information we need for the funding agreements, we're going to return those contracts and any final comments to CAA funding at millernash.com. As I mentioned, they are our legal support team to help us get through this funding agreement process. And just reminding everyone that we hope to have that primary funding agreement in place by early May. It is a somewhat tight timeline, but I am quite confident that we can get what we need accomplished with this community and the support that we have to answer your questions. Okay, a quick overview of the integration into the payment system. So once you have your contract signed and in place, CAA is building a service provider portal that will serve as really a one-stop shop for anyone needing to submit data to CAA or receive funding from CAA. This will be the portal through which you submit requests for your reimbursements, see invoices, see past payments, and find corresponding data outlined in the contract. So for example, if you need to revisit kind of the points of destination in the transportation reimbursement model, that will be in there for you to review. CAA will document all local government designations and contract addenda for each service provider in that portal. So you will be able to access all of the agreements that are in place and submit invoices and the data that will be requested for submission. So for example, an example of that would be for the system expansion funding addendum. You will see that there's a provision in there that when an order is placed, and you're seeking reimbursement for that, that you submit the invoice that shows that purchase order. So you'll simply be able to upload that into your portal, which will trigger payment. And so the service provider portal will enable the setup of payment accounts and easy receipt of payments. We really won't be able to get you set up in the service provider portal unless we have that primary funding agreement. So another reason to really get that to us in May. So we can get you your credentials to that service provider portal and you can become familiar with that. Okay, so just to reiterate, anyone receiving funding from CAA really needs to sign that primary funding agreement, underscoring that this needs to be really your initial focus. We would request and reach out to us with questions. And I think we will quickly walk through some of the activities we also have underway that relate to the funding agreement. So as I mentioned, we have launched consultation with the Priority A communities. This is a statutory prioritization of when communities receive funding. So Priority A communities are communities that are over 4,000 and don't yet have curbside collection. We've identified 15 Priority A communities that are on the schedule right now. 13 initial discussions and meetings have been set up with those communities. I got a chance to participate in one yesterday, and they are very excited about receiving the funding and getting the program off the ground and talking through the strategy of how to bring that service most quickly to their community. So we have 2 more Priority A groups that we have yet to schedule with, but gives you a sense that the team is out there engaging with communities already well in advance of the start date. Once we have Priority A communities in a good situation with their agreements and all their identified needs, we will move to Priority B for consultation. Um, and all of our conversations are rather standardized around the system expansion. So it begins with a review of your ORSOP results, a discussion where we really try to assess the need for any revisions, additions, or changes that need to be made to the request, and talk about how we ensure community readiness and the implementation timeline for their investments and their rollout. And then, so if you are not in Priority A, if you are in B through F, we still encourage you to prepare for and engage in this funding agreement process. Again, sign the PFA by May 1, and then we can begin to work on your associated addenda. Assign your funding designee with the Opportunity to Recycling Act report, which is due March 31st. Keep an eye out for a communication from our team around system expansion funding consultation. When your priority group comes up, we've kind of laid that out in the program plan, but the priority group consultation very well could come earlier than that. So we will make, if you miss the first communication, we'll work with you. We'll continue to try to reach out and secure time to have that conversation, but keep an eye out from an email from a CAA team member. And remember that system expansion funding listed in the program plan is really just a base starting point. It's the starting point of our conversation. We can always change or modify that request as we really talk through what the system is that's in place and what your community needs to be able to fully transition to collecting the USCL list. And I think just kind of in conclusion, our team is very excited to work with the community across Oregon to make the Recycling Modernization Act come alive. And we look forward to any questions or feedback that you might have from our team.
Thanks, Kim. That was great. Lots of information. Hopefully folks have learned some new things today. And we will have a chance to answer some questions. There's some already there in the Q&A, so we'll be able to get to some of those here in just a minute. But before we get to questions, I'd like to make one more plug for the other webinars in this series. You can see the future topics and dates listed here. Next month, we're going to cover the PRO recycling acceptance list and education and outreach. In March, we'll be talking about collecting and recycling the USCL materials and funding agreements, part 2. So that's the second part of this webinar today. All of these webinars run from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Pacific time. And Jerry is going to once again drop a link in the chat to the CA website where you can get more information and register for those upcoming webinars. Awesome. So I'm going to stop the recording.